Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something that is literally reshaping not just the physical world around us, but our internal worlds too. You know, the psychological landscapes where we all live, learn, and just try to get by. We're unpacking a really groundbreaking special collection from BMJ Mental Health. The research we'll be exploring today illuminates rapidly evolving terrain, and honestly, it's a total game changer. It fundamentally flips how we view climate-related distress, moving the conversation away from this purely clinical, doctor's office focus and towards a much broader, culturally inclusive, and scientifically robust perspective.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this right here is the fundamental question at the heart of our entire explainer today. For the longest time, the traditional assumption was basically that climate anxiety is simply an illness, right? Like a pathology that needs to be cured or medicated away. But as the climate crisis accelerates, researchers are urging us to step back and ask, is feeling anxious about a very real, very present environmental threat actually a medical disorder? Or is it just a completely natural response to a destabilizing world? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the massive gap in our current understanding.
Section 1. The Climate Psychology Gap.
So here's the reality. Our physical environment is accelerating into a crisis, but our psychological understanding, it's dangerously lagging behind. When you actually look at the data, a pretty stark research deficit emerges. Believe it or not, psychiatric studies focusing on climate-driven mental disorders are surprisingly rare. And it gets worse. Current psychological interventions show almost zero preventative benefit over standard control groups. Why? Well, mostly due to heavy bias and some really flawed methodologies. We're basically trying to measure a modern global crisis using fragmented, culturally insensitive tools. We absolutely, desperately need scientifically robust methods, because these individual-level tools just aren't cutting it for global policy.
Section 2. Youth and Climate Anxiety.
This lack of understanding is especially concerning when we look at the demographic with the most skin in the game. Young people are expressing just incredibly high levels of concern, and yet climate change education remains drastically underdeveloped in the global north. There's this fascinating qualitative study of German youth that hits the nail on the head, perfectly capturing their lived experience. They report these pervasive cognitive and emotional impacts, right? We're talking sleep disruption, impaired concentration, and just this persistent nagging worry. But, and this is absolutely crucial, this distress is intimately interwoven with adaptive strategies. They're constantly cycling through hope, meaning-making, and actual pro-environmental action. Anxiety and agency are coexisting. So what does this tell us? It means preparing youth for a destabilized climate requires way more than just handing them a list of scientific facts. It demands emotionally attuned strategies that actually honor their lived reality.
Section 3. Centering indigenous worldviews.
And this brilliantly illustrates how entirely different cultures process and experience the exact same global crisis. If we contrast Western scientific approaches with indigenous epistemologies, man, deep methodological fissures are exposed instantly. Western models tend to focus heavily on pre-existing academic frameworks and clinical diagnoses, checking boxes. But for indigenous peoples across the globe, the land, the body, and the ecosystem form a single, totally inseparable whole. Actually, get this. Concepts like mental health or even climate change often don't even have direct linguistic equivalents in these communities. Researchers highlight that trying to retrofit indigenous experiences into Western clinical checklists is just scientifically flawed. Effective climate mental health research absolutely has to center cultural self-determination and respect these holistic worldviews.
Section 4. The Unseen Bottom Billion.
We have a massive blind spot in current research when it comes to the bottom billion. The populations that are literally the most intensely exposed to climate impacts are, paradoxically, the least studied when it comes to eco-anxiety. Why is that? Well, it comes down to structural inequalities. Think about it. When a population is dealing with severe malnutrition, limited education, and minute-by-minute survival priorities, those immediate needs totally suppress the articulation of climate-specific distress. The eco-anxiety is definitely there, but it's rendered invisible by poverty and a lack of access. And this invisibility means policymakers have to act proactively to help these vulnerable populations instead of just sitting around waiting for psychological symptoms to neatly align with our Western diagnostic models.
Because honestly, when we ignore those broader impacts, the outcomes can be totally devastating. One of the absolute most sobering statistics from this BMJ collection quantifies the starkest possible outcome of climate-related stressors, a documented rise in heat anomaly-related suicides. The research specifically calls out the vulnerability of older men during abnormally hot seasons. To put that into perspective, this isn't just about feeling a bit worried about the weather. No, this is a severe life-or-death physical and psychological vulnerability. It literally demands immediate, climate-informed suicide prevention policy.
Section 5. Reframing climate distress.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the complete paradigm shift it represents. We've got to stop seeing climate emotions strictly as a pathology, as a sickness. Instead, researchers are defining them as an adaptive response. What does that mean? It means distress can actually be a functional signal in the context of a recurring environmental threat. There's this fascinating study of wildfire-prone communities in the USA that demonstrates this perfectly. In those towns, climate change anxiety and anticipatory disaster stress actually motivate preparedness. The worry keeps them alert, it keeps them packing their emergency bags, and ultimately it keeps them safe. The distress is completely situationally appropriate.
Let's move on and see how this builds across the globe. You can really see how this adaptive response takes shape in completely different contexts. Psychological responses to the climate crisis are shaped entirely by culture, exposure, and context. In the USA, as we just saw, anticipatory stress drives wildfire preparedness. Over in Europe, cross-national data shows that climate worry varies significantly depending on the local sociocultural and policy environment. And in Germany, remember, youth are balancing that pervasive worry with profound meaning-making. Across the board, folks, these responses are not universally pathological. They're highly complex, localized reactions to a shared global threat.
Section 6. Building psychological resilience.
All right, so knowing that this distress is very real and very complex, how do we actively transform immobilizing anxiety into meaningful engagement? Well, researchers highlight several specific tools to strengthen our individual coping capacities, especially for vulnerable groups. We're looking at things like positive psychology, building psychological capital, cognitive reframing, and mindfulness. Now, let's be completely clear here. These strategies do not solve the physical climate crisis. They won't magically lower global temperatures. But what they do is help individuals and communities process their environmental grief. They help transform a state of pure paralysis into a state of active, meaningful engagement. Basically, they prepare communities for ongoing disruption.
So the crucial point is this. Individual coping mechanisms are important, sure, but our interventions have to expand way beyond traditional clinical models. If we want to build ecologically sustainable futures, we need structural change. This means embedding climate mental health directly into national adaptation planning. It means updating primary care guidelines across the board, and honestly, it means totally reforming our education system so we actually honor the emotional realities of the next generation. We literally have to reimagine what constitutes evidence, resilience, and care in a world that is transforming this rapidly.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought directly inspired by all this research. I want you to look around your own community, your own daily life. What is your psychological connection to your changing environment, and how are you adapting? Are you paralyzed by the statistics, or are you finding ways to channel that anticipatory stress into functional, meaningful action? Because the climate crisis is reshaping our minds just as much as our coastlines. And really understanding that, well, that is the first real step toward true resilience. Thanks so much for exploring this incredibly vital topic with me today.